Hello, everybody. Welcome back to TarHeelIllustrated.com, or, of course, if you are watching on our YouTube channel, Tar Heel Illustrated. I'm THI staff writer Jacob Turner, and joining me, as he always does, our very own publisher, Andrew Jones. And AJ, we're here to talk a little Carolina football now that the season is officially over following Carolina's loss to South Carolina in the Duke's Mayo Bowl. It's a lot to talk about. We're going to hit on the offense in this video. We'll have another video coming out as well. We'll kind of hit on the defense and just kind of recap how the Tar Heels did on both sides of the ball this season, give a little insight and kind of thoughts on where the program is at as a whole right now. So before we dive into the offense, I'm going to run through some stats, just a quick little rundown of a few stats that kind of stand out from this year. Carolina finished with the number 3 offense in the ACC with 35.2 points per game. That's total offense stats. Number 10 offense nationally with 468.2 yards per game. Pretty impressive. Pretty kind of what we've seen from this offense as a whole since Phil Longo's come in with Mac Brown a few years ago. Usually very prolific. The offense that puts up a ton of yards usually puts up a ton of points. But just diving into some more stats real quickly. Sacks allowed, Carolina was number 127 out of 130 teams in college football, 3.77 per game. And kind of on the flip side of that, which is a little bit interesting, number 18 in rushing offense with 212.5 yards per game. So that stat right there, Carolina, pass blocking team, bad. Run blocking team, pretty good. Very contrasting on the offensive line for something we hit on a lot this year. Feels like we've talked about the O-line more than anything this year, kind of going back to early in the year especially. But just running through those stats, I mean, total offense-wise, Carolina was pretty good. Put up a lot of points, put up a lot of yards. Wasn't maybe as good as they have been in previous years under Phil Longo with some of the more talent they had at some of the skill positions and whatnot. But this was an offense overall that, at least statistically, was a pretty good offense. I know they had some games where they weren't great this year, laid some duds. Even going back to the bowl game, I thought they were atrocious at times on offense and looked like they didn't have a clue at times of what they were doing. Dominated in the trenches a lot for most of the year, but before we dive into a little more specifics, AJ, what are your kind of thoughts on how the offense was as a whole this year? Because like I said, statistically wise, looks pretty good. But when you kind of dive deeper into those sack numbers, rushing offense numbers, there's some stats in there that really kind of make you scratch your head and don't really make a lot of sense, if I'm being honest.
I'm going to go around my elbow to get to my kneecap here. So brace yourself. So they're number 18 rushing offense, and they allowed those 49 sacks for 300 yards, whatever it is. Sacks are rushing yards in college football. So let's say, for the sake of discussion, we eliminated the 49 sacks and just put them right there and put those yards in the rushing numbers, because those are the yards they actually gain going forward. Suddenly they're like a top 10 running team, right? Of course, but you really can't say that because the other teams are gauged based on their sacks allowed as well. But I think the flip side of that is one of the reasons they had some of the rushing yards they did and were forced into it was because Sam had to run a lot when he was under pressure. So the rushing numbers are really skewed. I like to look at conventional rushing numbers, and they had a 1,000-yard back. And then the last couple of games they played, British Brooks did really well. So let's say that was one guy doing, let's say THI did what British did against State and against South Carolina with that 63-yard run, and you'd have a dude with about 1,300 yards. So that's pretty good when you have a conventional rusher has about 1,300 yards. That means that they became a pretty solid conventional run team. But the sack issue is a major problem, and we've discussed this on podcasts before. I think so. And some people, I've got actually a lot of response to what I've said about part of my explanation about the sack numbers, and that's you got a bunch of 3-star offensive linemen, and I'm not denigrating these kids at all. But the difference between when you look at some of these kids who are 3-star offensive linemen, and Jacob, you've been to a lot of camps in the summer, and I've been to a lot of camps. And when a kid walks up right onto the field and he's got his shirt on with the taped on number, the stapled number on the camp shirt, and number 468, and that's the lineman in the 400s, right? And you think, man, look at that big dude. But then you quickly see, he's not very agile. He's big. He can move people. He can push the pile. But he doesn't have great footwork. He doesn't have great balance, and he's going to struggle in pass blocking. That's the difference between a 4 and 5-star and a 3-star. When we saw Zach Rice, we knew that guy had to have a different level. This year's offensive line, all of them were guys. The ones that started were all guys that came in under the previous regime, and there were a couple 4s in there that have struggled a little bit, but for the most part, they were 3-star guys. And I think that Carolina got a decent amount out of them. I think part of the other problem with the sacks were the fact that receivers were not getting open this year, other than Josh Downs. And he got bottled up pretty much the last 5 or 6 games. He hadn't scored touchdowns since October.
Yeah.
So there were other issues that played into it. I also think Sam ran into a few sacks and held the ball too long. Against South Carolina, I think it was Carolina's first field goal when they got to 10 points. Sam held onto the ball too long. She got rid of it and ended up getting sacked. They have to settle for a field goal, a long field goal, in fact. They were out of the red zone after that sack. So there were other issues at play, but I don't think the offense was all that great. It was good and probably good enough that the defense was average. They, in a bad ACC, they could have won 9 or 10 games.
Easily, yeah.
But they had touchdown issues in the red zone. They got in the red zone twice in the bowl game, set them for field goals. And they were going into the bowl game, I think they were 78th in the nation scoring touchdowns in the red zone, which is not good. So even with an offensive line that is decent at run blocking, it's not very good. Part of that was they got a little cute inside the red zone. I think sometimes they went away from what was working in the red zone, tried to throw, put themselves in bad situations. If you got receivers that can't get open in the middle of the field, they're not going to get open in the red zone either. So they probably should have stuck to the ground game a little bit more when they got into the red zone, but they didn't often do that. So, and then the last 3 games, Jacob, I think what's really telling, and there's been some people on our boards that have made a pretty compelling, interesting argument about the offense isn't as good as it appears. You know, they load up on some of these other teams, and then when they play the better teams, they're not that great. Well, okay, let's look at the evidence. In the last 3 games against Power 5 teams, that's Pitt, NC State, and South Carolina. Carolina averaged 24.7 points a game and 387 yards. So nowhere near what the numbers were. And really, they didn't exactly roll up and down the field against Wofford, but let's throw the FCS game out. I don't like to include those. So that tells me in the last 3 games of the season, the offense was average.
Yeah.
And the defense wasn't terrible at times. Like against Pitt, they were really good in the second half. Against NC State, they did more than enough to win until the last minute 57. But the offense didn't take advantage of situations. And then South Carolina was kind of that way. And the defense was really bad, but it wasn't like South Carolina had 600 yards of offense. They had 543 with a messed up situation at quarterback. But still, the Tar Heels offense didn't apply any pressure to South Carolina. So it made the defensive issues when they were there look even worse. So I think in the end, Jacob, pretty good offense, but it needs to be better. It needs to be better in pass protection. They need to be better running in tight situations, especially inside the red zone. And I Phil Longo, what his philosophy is in there, perhaps tweak that some. I've been told a lot of things. The recognition in the program is a lot of things need tweaking. That was before the bowl game.
Yeah.
So, and I think after the bowl game, maybe more than tweaking in some areas, but I think you can live with this offense with what it's done if the defense is a lot better, but the offense can be better and it can refine itself in a couple of important areas.
Yeah, most definitely. It was an interesting offense. I mean, I thought it was an offense at times that looked really good, like I hit on, and an offensive time at times that even really, I think it all kind of culminated in the South Carolina game. They just didn't do anything. Like the amount of possessions I kind of think, or series or drives that I think back to where Carolina just goes 3 and out and does absolutely nothing. You know, a lot of times Sam Howell gets sacked or they run for 2 yards. It was a very up and down offense. When you look at a guy like Sam Howell, as talented as he is, I know the game plan kind of shifted this year for him. He was forced to run a lot more. I think having a little bit less talent, like you said, at those skill positions at wide receiver, because that was really a big thing and a big cause for concern early in the year in particular, because, you know, there were games on end where, I mean, I'm there watching it. I'm like, there's just not guys getting open. I mean, it really, you know, Sam's back there, you know, and there are criticisms of Sam that I do agree with. I think he does try to do a little bit too much at times. I think he does hold on to the ball a little bit too much at times and create some of these sacks. But just, you know, especially in kind of that midpoint early in the year, I remember just so many times where it's just like, there's nobody open for him to throw to. And he's forced to use his feet and he's getting banged up and he's getting hit. I mean, I've been on the sidelines for a couple games this year where, I mean, quite frankly, I don't know how he kept playing some of the pops he took down there. I mean, just big time hits, and he would, you know, come back, and credit to him for continuing to do that. But just the fact that Carolina had such a good quarterback in Sam Howell, you know, it just wasn't able to do a lot with him this year. It just seemed like in his first 2 years, he was just so prolific. And I know he had a little bit more skill guys at that wide receiver position, at the running back position as well. I'm sure that played an effect this year. It had to play a part this year because if you look at the drop off from guys like, and no offense or nothing, THI had a great year with over 1,000 yards, but Javonte Williams and Michael Carter to Ty Chandler and DJ Jones that's healthy sometimes, a Caleb Hood that was banged up for a lot of the year, and then got a guy like British Brooks who all of a sudden against NC State looks like the best running back in the country, scores against South Carolina. And I think you told me he scored against South Carolina. I don't think he touched the ball again after that.
Well, he did, but it took about 2 hours. To your point,
it's just interesting.
People could go back and listen. Do you remember the 3 things we did after Virginia Tech?
Yeah.
And we both said, boy, because Sam was running a lot early. He's pulling the ball on RPOs, and a lot of it was design stuff. And we're like, man, if he's going to run the ball like this, it's a bad sign.
Yeah.
Because then a few games later, we were doing one of our preview pods. I can't remember what game it was before, maybe in FSU or Miami. And I'm like, well, I looked at Sam kind of like that guy at a lower end P5 basketball team, a really good player on a bad team has got to take a lot of shots.
Yeah, that's kind of what it felt like.
He shoots 41% from the floor, but he's averaging 18 points a game. People are like, boy, he's got some tough shot selection at times. Well, it's because someone's got to shoot the ball, right?
Yeah.
So Sam had sometimes he threw some really tough balls that were picked or that were missed because there weren't many big bread baskets that were open for him. So he had to get the thing in there. So I think it's interesting when people evaluate Sam, they're looking solely at numbers, and they have to be more aware of what the team dealt with, what he faced on a snap to snap basis. It was a very stressed year. Kudos to him for playing in the bowl game. It says a lot about him as a dude. It says a lot about him that when he talks about loyalty and team and family and all that stuff, they're the genuine words. He totally meant it. Could they have used getting a bunch of reps for Drake May in the bowl game? Yeah. And by the way, people have been asking, Drake didn't burn his red shirt. That was his 4th game. Criswell didn't play because he had already played in 4 games. So they both still have 4 more years of eligibility left in college football because Criswell gets 2020 back. So anyway, I think the offense is going to need some work. It's going to be different next year. It's going to have a different quarterback. It's going to have some new linemen. They're going to have different backs. You may see some of the young kids come in and get some opportunities. They may go get someone in the portal. Hell, by the time this podcast runs, they may have already landed somebody.
Wouldn't surprise me.
So, I do think that I wouldn't be surprised if they get 1 or 2 more kids from the portal. They have 2 right now. One of them on offense, Corey Gaynor, the offensive lineman from Miami. Mm-hmm. So they need to be better at wide receiver. They need to be better at running back. They need to be better with pass protection, and they need to run the ball better in tight situations in the red zone. That's a lot. For an offense as productive as they've been number 12, number 5, and number 10 the last 3 years under this regime. And that's really, really good. And that's certainly better than being a 21-17 football team, which is what they are in that span.
Yeah, it was we talked about it, and this is the kind of last thing we'll kind of talk about before we wrap this up. I don't think the offense was the issue this year. I mean, I know they had some games where they weren't great. I mean, looking at, Pittsburgh game against good Pittsburgh team, but only 23 points against them. But you look at, if FSU lost that game, only 25 points against them. They've had some games this year, even going to Georgia Tech, which is a horrible performance, 22 points against them, where they haven't played very well. But you look at some of these other score lines, and it's just the defense just letting up way too many points. I mean, even going back to the Wake Forest game, big win, 58-55 for the Tar Heels. I know it's one of a really good offense in Wake Forest, but 55 points for Wake Forest. NC State scores 34 on the Tar Heels, and I know they played actually pretty well in that second half in particular, but complete meltdown in the last couple minutes. So I think the offense wasn't as prolific and as efficient as we've seen. Sam wasn't as good as he has been in the past with some more guys at different skill positions. And you talked about being forced to use his legs more, being under duress more. I just didn't think he looked comfortable in the pocket a lot of times. I think he missed a lot of throws that.
Of course not.
I think he missed a lot of throws he usually makes too, because I think he's, maybe a little bit banged up about there, maybe a little bit more worried about getting hit back there, a little bit more uncomfortable in the pocket because of how he was played this year. But I don't really think the offense was the issue this year when you look at just some of the score lines, some of the games in which Carolina lost and the way in which they lost those games. There was a lot of games where offensively I think Carolina did enough to win and just didn't do it, couldn't stop teams or couldn't.
And I understand the criticism of the offense, and I think it's justified in some ways. They have 3 losses to teams that finish with losing records.
Yep.
Virginia Tech finished with a losing record. They got rolled by a bad Maryland team in their bowl game, and the offense didn't do squat against them. Mm-hmm. Carolina got routed against a horrible Georgia Tech team, which was number 92 in defense, and the offense didn't do squat against them. Mm-hmm. They got beaten by an FSU team, which the offense wasn't great against, and it was at home. And they lost to a South Carolina team that was 6-6 and kind of waddled its way into a bowl game. And, we'll talk about how bad the defense was in that game, but the offense needed to do more. And I don't think this offense was capable of doing more. It didn't have the personnel. There were a lot of parts of the puzzle that were just missing. And no matter how many times Phil Longo sat at the table and tried to make the puzzle work and tried to find, maybe there's a piece on the floor missing, or maybe there's a piece under his book or something like that, or maybe there's a piece still in the box. The pieces weren't all there. So the puzzle was never going to be completed with this year's team because the personnel dictated that just wasn't possible.
Mm-hmm. Most definitely. Yeah, it was an offense. I think that, like I said, statistically had a pretty good year, but I think a lot of Carolina fans probably expected a little bit more going into it. But when you really sit back and evaluate who they lost at those important positions, the amount of talent they lost at receiver, running back, I think when it comes down to it, they just didn't replace it. I know Ty Chandler had a good year, but just didn't.
Jacob, the mission of this program, when Mac Brown came back, he spoke about winning a national championship. He spoke about CFP, spoke about all those things. So teams that are in that neighborhood aren't talking in November about the guys they lost from the year before.
Yeah, no, definitely not.
But here we are in January, still talking about the guys that haven't been in this program for almost 13 months now.
Yeah,
that's bad. You've got to be able to replace. They've recruited very well. It's time that the skill. Nobody recruited by this staff played along the offensive line in the bowl game. So you've got to get those guys up. They've got to develop these kids. They got to be ready to go. Some of them are going to have to play next year. We're going to learn in year 4 a lot about the personnel development of this staff, and we got and people have to see it in order for this staff to get back on the trajectory the program was on.
Mm-hmm. Most definitely. Yeah.
So you can't talk about Javonte and Michael. I remember when Patrick Ewing left Georgetown, and I'm really dating myself here. For a couple of years, announcers were talking about, boy, when Patrick was there, didn't matter, man. He played 4 years. His time was up.
Yeah, he's not there anymore. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Don't you think Carolina could use Michael Jordan against Kentucky?
Yeah, I'm sure that would help.
Don't you think they could? There was a really interesting stat that came out Sunday about Robert Quinn, who isn't a fan favorite in Chapel Hill, but he did play there. There have been 9 players in the NFL to record 100 career sacks going back to like 1980, I think, when the sack record started being an official record. 4 of them played at Carolina.
Wow.
Don't you think that they would love to have Robert Quinn, Julius Peppers, or Lawrence Taylor, those kind of guys? So it doesn't matter. Javonte, Diami, Daz, Michael, none of that matters. Mm-hmm. The program, they played 13 games this year. This is who they were. And they were a good offense that needed to be better at times because the defense was so pitiful.
Yeah, most definitely. And last thing I'll say, I thought one of my actual criticisms of the offense, maybe, I don't know if this goes to the staff or whatever, was just you talk about how well Carolina's recruited, but you don't see those guys. I mean, a lot of guys on the offensive side of the ball where you talk about the O-line. It's not MAC recruited players. You talk about some of the skill position players besides Josh Downs. Antoine Green, that's not he's been here since, the Fedora era, and I'm not criticizing
He got injured under Fedora. Yeah. Well, I think we'll see a lot more of that.
But I think you need to. And I think at this point, there's no excuse for it. Yeah, definitely.
It takes time. And they had a lot of guys that were entrenched, but that's why year 4 is going to tell us a ton about this staff's ability to develop guys.
Yeah. Big time.
So, and there's no, who knows what to expect. I think that we've seen flashes from a lot of guys on both sides of the ball. Yeah. And then we've seen stretches where those very same guys are not very effective. Mm-hmm. So we'll see. And we'll dive into more of that when we do more of a program looking ahead pod that we're going to record after, a few more things possibly occur. Mm-hmm. And we have a better idea of what the program's going to look like moving forward.
Definitely. Still a lot to talk about, but I think that's a good place to wrap the offensive side of the Ball Up podcast in this one. A lot to hit on, a lot to talk about, but I think overall, statistically at least, a decent year from the offense, but it wasn't vintage North Carolina from what we've seen under Phil Longo in the 2 years previous to that when they were just absolutely electric at times and just put up points on everybody. And I know losing some of those skill position guys and not replacing them adequately had a big role to play in their struggles at times this year. But yeah, the Sam Howell era is officially over in Chapel Hills. He's declared for the NFL draft as well. But yeah, heck of a career for him. Probably didn't culminate in the amount of wins he would have liked to and the program would have liked to in that time period. But still major kudos to him and in the fantastic career he was able to have at Carolina, just setting records left and right. But stay tuned for the defensive podcast as well. We'll be recording that one here shortly. Stay tuned for that one where we're going to kind of dive into a defense that really struggled this year. As AJ laughs over there, is a good way to put it, though. They weren't great. I was trying to
You're being kind, young Jacob.
Trying to be nice to him a little bit. But if you want to hear more about our thoughts on the defense, check that one out. I've been Jacob Turner. He's been Andrew Jones. Make sure you guys keep it locked to TarHeelIllustrated.com. Like, share, subscribe. Hit that notification bell as well so you know every single time we upload. And we'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks.